tried to do something with this very first chapter called What Makes Us Human, which is also the subtitle of the book and the whole class. But I have to say, whoa, that's some pretty big questions. And so a lot of you, like you probably should, if you're confronted with a chapter called What Makes Us Human, went off on some huge, like, this is some heady stuff. What makes us human? And so this is kind of, this chapter is probably the least like what we'll do in the class, in the sense that it takes in a lot of what we might consider to be more in the realm of, definitely in the realm of evolution, of biological anthropology, even some archaeology in there. And it's a big overview of those things written by a couple of cultural anthropologists. Would I do the same thing all the time that they did? I have some issues with some of the things they said, and I'll tell you about some of the things that I didn't like as much. I thought they did a pretty good overview for being cultural anthropologists, but like I said, these are some huge, big questions. If this is what really excites you about anthropology, then, as some of you have already been, please do take a class with Professor Connie Anderson and the biological anthropology stuff, or the primatology stuff, or the anthropology of war stuff, or take a class with Professor Sugandhi on the archaeology, the fundamentals of archaeology. Or if you haven't been in an intro to anthropology class yet, at Hartwick, we do try to cover more of the four, what they would call the four fields. Here, more the three fields. We do more the biological, the evolution stuff, the primatology, the archaeology, and the cultural stuff there. So like I said, this is probably the least like what the rest of the class is going to be like. So it answers, it starts posing these huge questions, some of which are completely unanswerable. Completely unanswerable. They're completely huge. And in part, they're unanswerable because they come to us from some foundational issues of Western thought. And by Western thought, that's simply a way of saying the kinds of thinking that was being done in Europe and later in what we might call Northern Europe from around the year 1500 on. So at the time when Europeans became aware of other places, like people in the Americas, peoples in sub-Saharan Africa, eventually peoples in Australia and Papua New Guinea, places that were further away and more different than the peoples of Eurasia had been exposed to before. And so, this is a shorthand, it's an abbreviation for a whole realm of thinking, which has given us, we're a product of that. The whole world has become a kind of product of this movement of peoples and the expansion of European power into the rest of the world. We're probably on the downside of that now, or the other side of that, but it's a hugely important issue, and it gives us a lot of the things that we still think about and debate within the college system, the university system, things that come up all the time and time again. So for the Europeans, it wasn't just what makes us human in the sense of all the humans, it was what makes us human as we're the European humans. We know we're human, but is everybody else human? Is everybody out there human, or are there some people that look kind of like human, but they're more, when Linnaeus and other Europeans had those schemes that they would talk about the wild man and people that might have tails, and there was all this speculation about the kinds of creatures that they might find out there. And so one of the more obnoxious and arrogant questions that the Europeans were asking was, is everybody human? And then I guess sort of along with that, is everybody the same? Do we all share certain human characteristics across our societies, across different human groups? Are there things that make us human that we can say, aha, everybody does this or that, and we can come up with a list of things and say, these are the things that make us human. Another question here is that what gave rise to human behavior? Are the things that we do, say, and think, our capacities, are they rooted in nature? I don't know, in the early days, they probably wouldn't have said biology. That's a little bit of a later thing, but they would have talked about nature and the natural world. And so the question was, you know, are people sort of destined by their what we would call their biology, what we would call genetics? The idea of genetics and our genes has taken on a lot of these ideas from before about the universality of human behavior rooted in our biology or in our nature. Another big question was, are we getting better? Is humanity, our different societies, progressing? Are we getting better and better and better? Other people thought maybe we were getting worse and worse and worse. In particular, well, Timur, if you were talking about this in the 1500s, a long time ago, like 500 years ago, what kind of perspective might you take on this? Who do you think might have given you this whole natural thing?
People believed in a God.
Huh?
People thought it was a God.
People thought it was from God, exactly. These issues in in the early years were rooted in a theological perspective. So the idea is not probably, it would actually be incorrect to say is humanity progressing. The question is, does God have a purpose for humanity? Are we all going to heaven, or are we degrading? I mean, that was the other idea in religion, right? We're all getting worse and worse, and it's only because of the grace of God that some have been saved. Otherwise, we're bound for purgatory or hell, right? So all of these issues were rooted for a long time in theology, in reading biblical texts, and and these kinds of ideas. And it is only, in the later part of say 300 years later, and especially since the 1860s, when these questions became linked more to the idea of evolution. And people put the same questions, those same philosophical huge questions, they put them into the idea of, well, is it because of our evolution that, who is human? Are there human things that we all do because we evolved to be that way? Is human behavior because we evolved that way? And evolution itself, as still to this day persists, evolution is completely linked to the idea of progress, right? Whenever you say evolution, you automatically think getting better. Just to preview something, evolution should only mean change over time. It should not mean getting better. It should not mean getting worse. It just means things are changing. But like I said, these things, because of their roots in philosophy and in the theology of the time, these questions all got taken in to the idea of evolution and linked to those ideas more than they were linked previously to the idea of a God. But of course, the idea of a God and creationism, as we read, did not go away. But for the most part, certainly in the university system, among the people who are writing books, that idea would be replaced by these debates around evolution. So the reason why some of these questions are so big is because they're so rooted in our ideas, our inheritance of what the world is like. And it's also the reason we can't solve these questions, because they're deeply philosophical in nature. Now, the other thing that I would say here is that when we're talking about Western thought from 1500 on, we are not just talking about something that happens inside of Europe. Although a lot of people want to portray it that way, they want to think that it was only in Europe that all these things developed, but it was actually born in a context in which Europeans were exploring, conquering other peoples, setting up colonial governments, enslaving other peoples, and basically setting up a system of the world in which they wanted to keep the power for themselves, extract resources and from other peoples and basically take things over. And so a lot of the ideas that were circulating and are still today were born in this encounter between people who considered themselves to be Western and civilized and the people that those people considered to be savage or primitive or backward or just weird or other. And so I want to put up a quote for you. This is from the journal, the diary of an English person who was traveling around, actually was sailing around at the time, wasn't a sailor, but was on a boat, and said this about, you don't have to copy this down, especially because it's not stuff that we'd want to repeat about anybody. Was in the Tierra del Fuego in what is now Argentina, and was observing some people who would probably be called hunter-gatherers at the time, indigenous to the area. And this is what this person said about the people. It's around the 1830s. The language of these people, according to our notion, scarcely deserves to be called articulate, right? Can't understand them. We have no reason to believe they perform any sort of religious worship. The different tribes have no government or chief. They can't know the feeling of having a home and still less that of domestic affection. Mean. Their skill in some respects may be compared to the instinct of animals, for it is not improved by experience. So basically, I mean, this person is saying that the people that they're observing are perhaps in the same species, biologically human, but they are like animals. They have, their instincts can't be improved. They don't have a government. They don't have religion. They don't have a language. So this was the kind of attitudes, this is not unique, this is the kind of attitudes that were prevalent at the time towards other people that Europeans were espousing. By the way, a lot of these, this is something that people, a lot of these very same stereotypes are often used against people in our own society, barely modified. For those of you who know the history of the notion of being articulate in Black America, and whether someone is articulate or not, might recognize that that's these ideas that the other people don't have the right kind of religion, they don't know how to govern themselves, their home life is a mess, they're just out there doing their instinctual thing, right? All these stereotypes are also put upon people who are in our own society, sometimes on immigrants or on African Americans. These kinds of things, or poor people in general, the same kinds of stereotypes. By the way, anybody know who would have written words like this? Somebody we read about in our text. Charles Darwin. He was on the voyage of the Beagle. Remember that famous thing where he's sailing around, sails up to the Galapagos Islands where he finds the finches. You always hear about the finches. Everybody knows about the finches, but does anybody talk about this part of his journey where he was observing other people? No, of course not. No, I'm not trying to get down on Darwin here. Darwin is a representative of his time. But, it's kind of interesting that actually recently, Augustine Fuentes, a biological anthropologist, wrote an op-ed or an essay, I think it was in Science or in Nature, And he was basically saying, hey, look, we have to examine Darwin's thoughts. I mean, examine his thinking, but also his prejudices, especially when he came out with The Descent of Man. And people just went nuts about this in terms of criticizing Fuentes for criticizing Darwin. And I'm not sure why that is that we put Darwin on this humongous pedestal, but I guess we're scared if we criticize Darwin, we'll become creationists again. But the point of the matter is, why not take people for who they are and the prejudice of their time? And so when in your textbook, they say that Darwin was an evolutionary anthropologist, I'm going to have to say that is untrue. Darwin was not an anthropologist. He was not a very good anthropologist at all. He was a very smart person. He was a keen observer of the natural world, but he had very little affinity for the kind of work that an anthropologist would be doing among other peoples. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was also discussed in your textbook, has anybody heard of Alfred Russel Wallace before this class? Well, you should have from me an intro to anthropology, but Alfred Russel Wallace was a scientist working around the same time as Darwin. He was off and he traveled a lot more than Darwin did, and he was actually a lot closer to the peoples in these other environments. And actually, if there were an evolutionary anthropologist, I'd probably give it to Wallace instead of giving it to Darwin. Wallace was crucial because he independently, as he says in this textbook, he independently developed the idea of the mechanism of natural selection. And he wrote a letter to Darwin. Darwin had been working on this idea, and he was afraid to publish it because of the controversy that it might have. When he got Wallace's letter, he was basically like, oh shit, I got to get this out there because I've been working on this thing. So they actually published this jointly together, Darwin and Wallace. But you never hear about Wallace. The reason why you never hear about Wallace is that Wallace knew better than this about the peoples in other environments. And he knew they were smart, but he couldn't figure that out evolutionarily. So Wallace came to the conclusion that the peoples in other societies, that our brains, their minds had been created by God. And he published that. Now, some of you may know that if you posit that you're an evolutionist, but your brain has been created by God, you're going to get thrown out of things. You're not going to get invited to the John Stone parties anymore. They do not like that idea. So Wallace has basically been erased from the idea of evolution, even though he was a co-founder of it with Charles Darwin. And he got erased by being a nice guy. Was it a good idea that God created the minds of other people? No, that was a stupid idea. But at least he recognized sympathetically the kinds of intelligence and capabilities that they had. Basically, all this is to say that whenever we are talking about Western thought and Western philosophy and all these theological evolutionary stuff that people like to throw around in the West, we'd better be thinking about race, because that was part of this idea, both racial ideas about other peoples outside of different societies and racial ideas about people in what we might consider our own societies, within European societies, within American societies of the Americas. And so whenever we think about these issues, we have to think about the idea of race and how much that shaped this encounter between the West and others, and how race was basically born. Our ideas about race come from this period. So, why does this matter to us? Basically, that's what we just looked at. You had this philosophical ruminations, right? The thinking and ideas for philosophers. Anthropology actually comes out much later. There were no academic anthropologists at the time of the Spanish explorers. There were no anthropologists around until after actually Charles Darwin, until about 100, 150 years ago. And the reason I say they're an empirical answer is because in some ways the anthropologists were sent out to get the actual field data, to answer these questions, but not just sort of in a sitting around kind of way, to actually go out, talk to people, observe them, gather data. We'll be talking about that next Thursday in our section, our chapter called Research Methods. But, you know, in some ways, before the time of anthropology, people were speculating. They relied on travel journals like Darwin's travel journal or the journals of soldiers or missionaries. And then they'd sort of gather all that material together and think about it that way. So what were the answers to these questions that anthropology eventually came out with? First of all, anthropologists said, yes, folks, everybody is human. And in fact, they're not only human, they're equally human. There's not sort of better humans and worse humans. All humans are humans and they all have a number of shared capacities. Which takes us to our next point, which is that there are human universals. We'll talk about this in a second. There are things that everybody does, like language and eating and sleeping and cooking. But those are also the things that we most look at and differentiate each other on. So you might say that the things that are most the same about us are also the things that are most different about us. So, you know, when we start speaking a different language and we can't understand each other, instead of saying, well, that person isn't articulate, you might try to learn the language and see what's going on there. The language itself might be very sophisticated. So the idea of human behavior is human behavior all because of nature or biology. Anthropologists have taken different approaches to this, but the general answer is no, it is not all due to biology or human nature or some sort of genetic programming, because if it were, then everybody would be the same all throughout the world, right? And the answer to this is that anthropology in general has stressed the idea of culture. All the things that you learn to do during your lifetime. And we especially learn culture. Well, Jonathan, when do we learn culture? What's weird about human beings? Now I'm thinking about what you wrote about how dependent we are. What's strange about how dependent we are on our parents?
Oh, sorry.
No, no problem.
We raise our young for much longer than others.
Much longer than others, for sure. I mean, you know, the chimpanzees and bonobos, they were together with their parents for like 5 or 6 or 7 years, which is already a ton more time than most animals spend with their parents. But we're together with our parents for like 30, 40 years before we finally get it. Oh, no, you guys are launching out there, maybe just 20 years, but still, it's a long time, a long time. And the human being is born completely dependent on other people. You know, anybody who's ever seen a horse being born or a cow being born, and the next thing you know, the horse or the cow is running around. Humans are just like, we're carrying them around forever. They never learn how to walk. You have to help them how to walk. You have to help them how to eat. You have to do all this stuff for them. Wait till you have to do it. It's crazy how much you have to do. And so you're carrying this kid around completely helpless, completely dependent for a long time. All that time, the biology is going, the brain is developing. Remember those big brains that are twisting out of the birth canal? The brains haven't grown up yet because they're all helpless and getting formed. So now you're carrying a child around and singing songs to it and talking, and all this culture stuff is coming into us at a time when the brain and the body are developing. So our culture does feel very natural to us because, wow, we kind of grew up right in it. But we learn how to do all these things that in other creatures we might think are more, I'm not big on this word, but instinctual. So we don't hunt instinctually. We learn how to hunt if we're going to be in a hunting society. Or some people never learn how to hunt because they're going to grow food. And some people never grow food because they're just going to rely on a refrigerator. So all these things we learn how to do, but they're learned. All the things that in other creatures for survival, you might say, are instincts or natural, or they start doing within a few days of being alive, we take a long time to develop, and we develop them in our own cultural way. So, yeah, and the other part of this is that when we look at nature, when we look at the examples of nature, it's a lot more complicated than we once thought. So one example is the bonobos and the chimpanzees. For a very long time, all of our ideas about human nature as rooted in primatology came from the chimpanzees. And well, I love the chimpanzees. But then we started looking at this other related species called the bonobos. What do we know about the bonobos, Willa? Much more cooperative, female dominated, no murder reported. They're always having sex all the time, especially in captivity. They may be bored. They're having non-reproductive sex a lot of homosexual, what we would call homosexual activity, all kinds of, boy, bonobos. Bonobos turn out to be equally related to us as chimpanzees. That is to say that in the evolutionary line, there was a split between the creatures that led to chimpanzees and led to humans. And then there was another split later on between a speciation event about 2 million years ago, event process, these things never happen as events, between bonobos and chimpanzees. Which is to say that there's no reason to believe necessarily that we're more like chimpanzees or more like bonobos, because we're actually equally related to both. And of course, Gabe, we always have to watch out for those chimpanzee studies. Why?
Because some of them are like misleading. Like the big like chimpanzee war was basically like, oh, we have multiple groups of chimpanzees. The monkeys they hunt are like, so one group here, the monkeys they hunt are like in between them. So like whenever they go to hunt the monkeys, the two groups of chimps like see each other, and that causes problems. But then everyone would be like, oh no, the monkeys are not the monkeys, the chimps are seeking out other chimps to fight them, but they're really not.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of issues, but one of the issues is that when we first started studying chimpanzees, we often went in and gave them food and stuff, like we changed their whole hierarchy around. Also, a lot of these groups have been extremely impacted by the influence of humans, so their habitats have been reduced. So you always have to be careful of these huge generalizations that arise from these studies. Nature turns out to have many different models in it. And the sort of what's called the law of the jungle turns out to be not very much of a law at all. All right, is humanity progressing? Like I said, evolution is change over time, and societies we know are always changing. But whenever we talk about, well, are we getting better? Is society progressing? You have to be really careful. Because, well, Lexi, if we're progressing and progressing and progressing, what have we done that might make us think that in our world, we might not have done such a good job? So here we have a creature that has gotten so smart and so technologically advanced that they're potentially destroying their own habitat and making it unlivable. Is that progress? Right? Yeah. How come we can't fix it? Maybe we're not that smart anymore. Right? So I'm not saying, I'm just saying whenever somebody says things are getting better, you have to think about, well, who is it getting better for? How long is it getting better? Is it going to be better forever, or is this just something that can be measured? It's very difficult to measure better, by the way, right? So, we all thought that the computers were going to make everything better, but it turns out it just helps us do more work. So did that help? I don't know. Anyway, the point is, be careful about these, and also about, the idea that everything's going to hell. You just have to be careful with those ideas, because that's a value judgment you're placing upon certain events in human history. So I'm not going to try to say there's no measure of progress or things are worse now than before. Again, it's simply trying to put things in perspective in terms of the long-term possibilities going on. And the other thing that I would say in terms of evolution, and boy, I wish in some ways I should teach a whole course on this. It would be like all the weird things we've been taught about evolution, some of which your textbook authors completely perpetuate. So I don't know, you probably won't believe me, and even if you did believe me, it's so ingrained in us. But the idea of that evolution is survival of the fittest is, it's not the best characterization of evolution. And the reason it's not is because when we say fittest, it's fittest to a particular environment. And as we've just heard, the environment and societies are always changing. So what is fit in one environment may be not so fit in a different environment. And since those things are always changing, there's no real measure of absolute fitness. And so survival of the fittest is actually a phrase that Darwin borrowed from the sociologist Herbert Spencer. Some people think it was one of the dumber things that Darwin did. Originally, Darwin didn't talk about evolution, nor did he talk about survival of the fittest. His original preferred phrase was descent with modification. And sometimes I think, if we would have stuck with that, there wouldn't be all this anti-evolution stuff, because who's going to say, I'm against descent with modification? Right? I mean, it's a very much more neutral idea, which really describes what's going on. Now, sure, certain frequencies of genes and things evolve, but they're not necessarily corresponding to fitness or to the best. A lot of creatures reproduce. You may know some of them who are not the fittest members of the species, and they have a lot of offspring. So, it's a lot of things have happened, and we have become way too concentrated on the idea of selection. Actually, I did want to pause for a second on the idea of selection, because one thing did get to me here. All right, where's that peacock? There's a peacock in there somewhere, right there, a peacock. What could explain this crazy peacock? What explains the peacock's, what's that called? The colorful tail feathers. Are those good to have? Yeah, Jonathan.
So that was sexual selection, selecting for traits that may not have any sort of benefit to survival, but rather are more.
Right. So this is, I don't know. Did they teach you about sexual selection in high school? No, it's too sexy. All right. So sexual selection was something that Darwin, Darwin was into that. And it's, it's a really interesting idea, and you never want to leave, you never want to downplay it, because, people and other creatures are always checking each other out about who to mate with, and that might come into things. But yeah, you can't explain that stupid peacock thing. It looks really pretty, but it must suck to carry that around all the time. It has no natural selection advantage. So Darwin was like, well, that must be sexual selection. By the way, the peacock, which is more beautiful? The male or the female? Yes, the male, the peacock, right? And so the idea of sexual selection in general has been that males are competing for females. And so the females are going to choose based on, I don't know, beauty or strength or something. And so you develop these traits as a male because that's what's going to happen. So then our authors say that there's this other crazy person who says, well, that's the way the sense of humor developed in human beings. Now think about this for a second. If the sense of humor is related to sexual selection, what does that, aha, all right, what would that mean? You've laughed already. What would that mean for us if sense of humor comes from sexual selection? You think the idea is funny in general, which it is true, it is funny. Well, let's think about this. Let's be logical about this. Remember the peacock with the big feathers competing for males? Yes. Huh? Women aren't funny. And there have been some sexist comedians who claim this sort of thing, but I've seen some very funny female comedians as well, and trans comedians. Anyway, yeah, I mean, it's kind of absurd, right? It's a little bit absurd. And when we think about people like Darwin and some of these evolutionists, you have to remember they were swimming in the ideas of their time. You don't necessarily want to take them seriously when they're talking about sex and race and these kinds of things, because often they didn't know what they were talking about. So watch out for ideas that, you know, women aren't funny because of sexual selection. There we go, I got it. There's a good laugh. Okay, so that's what anthropology had to say about this stuff. Now, in terms of what we actually did in your chapter, and I want to talk a little bit about this in terms of how we talked about how there are things that we see across the human species, that everyone uses tools, for example. But tools are something that we learn how to use, and we learn them in a certain social group, and we learn how to use a specific set of tools. We all cook across the human species. There's a lot of debate about whether we've been cooking for 2 million years or 200,000 years, but you know, the point is, in the world of at least for 100,000 years, all human societies have been cooking. But it's also something that is the most, what we differentiate among each other extremely on, right? What kinds of foods you cook, how long you cook them, what kind of you're going to eat sushi or not. These are things that people get very animated about. If they were simply things that were like, okay, we all do this, it's cool. You know, it's also something we learn how to do, and we learn how to do it differently. And we also learn it biologically, right? We learn how to eat the foods that we're surrounded by, and we learn how to not like other things like termites. If we didn't grow up in a termite eating society, that kind of makes us weirded out. Everyone has capacity for, in a particular language. Pero si yo empiezo a hablar en español, some people can understand and some people can't. So, you know, it's something that we all have, but other people get very upset about if somebody starts speaking a different language and they say, oh, that's not a real language. There's you know, everyone uses symbols, but of course, you have to learn what those symbols represent. And if the symbols occur to us outside of a certain context, there's actually no way of knowing. What if you wanted to know what this bison was? What was it for? Who knows, right? But wow, they can do things. There's some art 16,000 years ago. You know, from like 40,000 years ago, we have examples of amazing symbolic art. Who knows what people were doing? I mean, it's interesting to think about, but it doesn't necessarily have a you know, it's symbolic behavior. Social life. So a number of you talked about this in terms of, you know, everybody has to has to have a family and reproduce and things, but as we'll talk about this one later on, you know, we do this in all kinds of different ways, and there's different ways of getting married and different numbers of people you might be married to, and the rituals and all these things. Everyone has them, but we learn how to do them, and we learn how to do them differently. So this is a crucial insight of anthropology to these large questions from before. And so now I want to turn to the idea of race and what was instrumental in what we talked about, these ideas that Darwin is channeling to us from the voyage of the Beagle and the people in the Tierra del Fuego. So anthropology, you know, it's not that they were any better than anybody else, but from doing these kinds of field studies and from actually interacting with people, they began to take a very different approach to these ideas of race and the stereotypes of the time. And the basic message of anthropology is that, you know, hey, wait a second. If you actually learn other people's languages, you might learn something, that they have sophisticated languages which are different, but not worse or better than yours. And if, you know, you may not have a church exactly, or you may not have a religious structure, but you might have a sophisticated sense of religious ideas and spirituality. And you might want to learn about that because that might be interesting. And you may not have a state government with a bunch of police ready to beat you up all the time, but that doesn't mean that you can have that you're lacking in a sophisticated political system, which might be organized in a different way that we don't necessarily understand just from the outside. Remember, these are the kinds of things that people were saying others didn't have. We just talked about marriage and kinship, that, you know, even though people in other societies might get married differently and have different kinds of kinship reckonings, they may actually have a complex system of kinship, which is difficult for us to understand unless we try and figure it out. That, you know, people have different ways of manipulating the environment. That it turns out that hunter-gatherers didn't have it quite so terrible as was depicted. The art, we just saw some bison, that other people can do art and sculptures and painting and rock art and dance, that they have knowledge about their environment, that, you know, people have sophisticated ideas and have been living in their world. I'm not going to say all societies are one with their environment. That's baloney, but they might have very sophisticated ideas about sustainability and how to live in a certain environment, and it might be a good idea to get to know those ideas. So in contrast to a lot of people at the time who wanted to simply discard or look down upon people who did things a different way, this was sort of a founding issue of anthropology. A little bit of a detour here. What if you wanted to know, in anthropology, because of the evolution stuff, we often compare humans to what are always called our closest living relatives, the bonobos and the chimps. And one of you wanted to know if there are other animals that human beings would be compared to. And I mean, I guess I've heard about, you know, dolphins and stuff like that. But in other societies, bonobos and chimps might not be, or non-human primates might not be necessarily what you'd think of as most related to us. So I was just thinking about, for example, the idea of the bear in many Northwestern and Arctic societies, and how the bear would be seen as a very powerful creature and in some ways on the same level as human beings. And you may think, well, that's kind of some crazy indigenous idea, but having grown up in Montana, there was people who discovered a bear skeleton in the woods, and they told me that actually it's weird, unless you know what you're doing, the skeleton of a bear and the skeleton of a human look a lot alike. Freaky. In other societies, they might think of the jaguar as, you know, there are people that can turn into jaguars, and so that the jaguar might be analogous to human beings. So the point of anthropology in some ways is to question our own assumptions and to try and learn a little bit from people who might think in a very different way than we do. The other thing that anthropology told us about is that a lot of the people that that anthropologists were studying had already been decimated by the colonial encounter. And so when Darwin was looking at the people in the Tierra del Fuego, those weren't the same people who might have been around there 200 or 300 years ago. Those people had already been shaped by the Spanish conquest, and a lot of people's stuff had been stolen. A lot of people's land had been taken over. And a lot of the people that anthropologists ended up studying 100 years ago were in some ways, I mean, you might consider them refugees from their original society. And so there's a lot of inequality there, which might account for some of these differences and the kinds of things that people were describing as cultural differences were actually due to inequality. So anthropology started to look at the idea of race, especially with regard to other societies, in a very different way. And again, eventually, anthropology looked at race differently in our own society. So this is not going to be, if you want to go through the complete explanation of anthropology on race, it's not going to happen here. I'd recommend Professor Anderson's biological anthropology class, or hopefully some of you got this in Intro to Anthropology. But basically, we questioned, or anthropologists questioned, the idea that people came in these fixed racial groups and that your race or your biology was determining of your capacities. And so just to be clear, all the human beings on this planet form one interbreeding species. We used to think that the Neanderthals were a completely separate species, but now it turns out we did some interbreeding with them as well. So in fact, they were at best a subspecies. So there are no other species that are not that people, we're the last bipedal large-brained creatures left. There are not now 20 different species. There's only one. And we know this because every time people come into contact with each other, they might fight, or they might trade, or they might say they hate each other, but they're always going to be interbreeding with each other. It's something we like to do a lot, even if we say we have laws against it, we just circumvent the laws. And so our human experience, you know, the humans evolved for the most part in Africa, but our human experience has been one of moving around within Africa, moving out of Africa, moving back into Africa. It's been marked by lots and lots of people moving around and migrating. That has been essential to the human experience. And for hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years, trading with other groups, moving things around, talking to people, and being interconnected. And so even in the hunting and gatherer groups that spread out all over the world, they were almost always what we call exogamous. That is to say, you had to marry outside of your group. And so you would always be connected to the people around you in some ways. Human groups that get isolated, that get cut off from each other, tend to die. And so people are, the way we are as human beings is by being able to trade, migrate, and connect with each other in all kinds of different ways. Now, so the idea that people come in these biological units called races is incorrect. But what we do know is that the idea of race and the laws around race and the social inheritance of race is very real. It has a real effect in the world. So just because people don't come in these groups genetically, biologically, that we think we see, doesn't mean we aren't doing race all the time and haven't been doing race for a long time. And so what this does is that it creates and perpetuates the inequalities between people, between other societies, as we saw, and within our own society. And those inequalities are going to have biological effects. So if your nutrition isn't as good, if your healthcare isn't as good, if your schools aren't as good, if you're going to have trouble getting the same kinds of employment, all of these things are not just cultural things. They are also going to affect your body and your developing person. And so this is something that that your authors include here as a statement by the American Physical Anthropology Association a couple of years ago that kind of updated some of the statements that anthropology had. Because for a long time, anthropology tried to separate the idea of culture from biology. But it's important to realize that our social ideas, the things we learn, also have a biological manifestation. So life expectancy and maternal mortality, that's a biological effect, and it's influenced by our ideas about race, racism, and other peoples. So this is where anthropology ends up, and then we end this chapter, this sort of big question chapter, with these ideas about some hopefully concrete answers, which we'll be exploring through the rest of the course about some of these things. Questions?